The voices in Sarah's head were deafening that morning. "You'll never make it," they whispered as she stared at her reflection, her chef's uniform still crisp and new. Opening night of her restaurant was just 12 hours away, and the weight of her life savings and her dreams hung in the balance. But it wasn't the food critics or the investors that terrified her, it was the relentless chorus of doubt that had been her constant companion since childhood. Sarah Chen smoothed down her chef's jacket, her fingers lingering on the sage and time-embroidered logo. The name had come to her 3 years ago, during one of her grandmother's last cooking lessons. Now, at 32, she was about to fulfill or destroy everything she'd worked for. The morning light filtering through her apartment window caught the silver threads in the embroidery, making them shimmer like the tears she was fighting back. Her phone buzzed again, the 5th time in the past hour. Another well-meaning message from her mother: "It's not too late to reconsider, sweetheart. The corporate position is still open." Sarah's throat tightened. She'd left her prestigious role as executive sous chef at one of the city's most celebrated restaurants to pursue this dream. Her former boss had called her crazy. Maybe he was right. The memory of that conversation crashed over her like a wave. "You're throwing away a secure future," he'd said, his disappointment evident. "Fine dining is dying. People want quick, casual, Instagram-worthy food. They don't want your grandmother's refined Chinese-French fusion concepts." The words had stung then, and they stung now, joining the cacophony of doubts in her head. Sarah arrived at the restaurant at dawn, her footsteps echoing through the empty dining room. She'd designed every inch of this space, blending modern elegance with touches that reminded her of both her grandmother's kitchen in Taipei and the French bistros she'd fallen in love with during her culinary training in Paris. Hand-painted tiles imported from France lined the open kitchen's walls, while traditional Chinese wooden screens created intimate dining spaces throughout the room. The fusion wasn't just in the food, it was in every detail. She'd just finished reviewing the prep lists when her phone rang. Her heart dropped as she saw the caller ID, Marcus, her sous chef. "Sarah, I'm so sorry," he began, his voice rough with what sounded like more than just morning grogginess. "I've got food poisoning. Bad. I can barely stand." The negative thoughts pounced immediately. "See? Everything's falling apart. Just like everyone said it would." Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the steel prep table, her grandmother's words echoing from years ago: "The loudest voice in your head isn't always the wisest." But wisdom felt far away as she ended the call and faced the reality of opening night without her right-hand man. The prep list suddenly looked impossible: specialty dumplings with foie gras, delicate fish preparations that required expert timing, and sauces that needed constant attention. She designed the menu to showcase everything she'd learned in her 15 years of cooking, but now it felt like hubris. The next blow came an hour later. The specialty ingredients she'd ordered, rare mushrooms from Japan, specific herbs she'd sourced from a small farm outside the city, and the particular Burgundy wines she needed for her signature sauces, were delayed due to transportation issues. The supplier's apologetic email might as well have been a death sentence. By noon, Sarah was drowning. Her remaining staff worked diligently around her, but she could sense their anxiety. The replacement sous chef from the culinary staffing agency was competent but unfamiliar with her vision. Every time she had to explain a technique or correct preparation, the voices grew louder: "You're not ready for this. You never were." She retreated to the walk-in refrigerator, needing a moment of quiet. The cold air hit her face, and suddenly she was 8 years old again, watching her grandmother prepare dinner in their small kitchen in Queens. The memory was so vivid she could smell the star anise and garlic and hear her grandmother humming as she worked. "A with Macron I, little one," her grandmother had said, noticing Sarah's frustrated tears over a failed attempt at folding dumplings. "When the dough fights you, you don't fight back. You listen to what it needs." Sometimes the best cooking comes from learning to be quiet and pay attention. Standing in her empty restaurant, surrounded by gleaming surfaces and untold possibilities, Sarah closed her eyes. For the first time in years, instead of fighting the negative thoughts, she simply acknowledged them. They were there, yes, but they weren't her. Like clouds passing across the sky, she could choose to watch them drift by without letting them become her storm. The clarity came suddenly, like the first burst of flavor from a perfectly balanced sauce. Sarah gathered her staff, her voice steady despite the chaos of the day. "We're changing the menu," she announced. The replacement sous chef looked alarmed, but Sarah continued. "Not entirely. But we're going to simplify and focus on what we know we can execute perfectly. And we're going to add something special." She pulled out her grandmother's recipe notebook, its pages worn and stained with decades of use. Inside were the dishes that had first taught her the healing power of food, not just fancy French techniques or traditional Chinese preparations, but the beautiful space where both cuisines met, where love and tradition transformed into something new. "These are the dishes that taught me to cook," she told her team, running her fingers over her grandmother's elegant Chinese characters and English notes. "They're not as elaborate as what we planned, but they're honest. They're real. And we can make them perfectly." The afternoon passed in a blur of focused activity. Sarah worked alongside her team, teaching them her grandmother's techniques while incorporating the French elements she'd mastered over the years. The replacement ingredients they sourced locally weren't what she'd originally planned, but as she worked with them, she remembered another of her grandmother's lessons: the best chefs don't fight their ingredients. They listen to them and learn what they want to become. Her movements became sure, deliberate, each slice and stir a meditation in motion. The negative thoughts still whispered, but their power had diminished in the face of her focus. She showed her team how to make her grandmother's red braised pork belly, but with a French red wine reduction instead of the traditional Shakesing wine. The dumplings were simplified but made more elegant with a classic beurre blanc sauce infused with ginger and scallions. As the new menu took shape, Sarah felt something shift in the kitchen's energy. Her staff moved with growing confidence, inspired by her calm determination. Even the replacement sous chef was caught up in the momentum, offering suggestions that showed he understood what she was trying to achieve. The first guests arrived precisely at 7. Sarah watched from the kitchen pass as they were seated, her heart racing but her hands steady. The dining room filled quickly: friends, family, local food critics, and curious diners drawn by the pre-opening buzz. The orders began flowing in, and the kitchen moved with the synchronized grace of a well-rehearsed orchestra. Each dish that left the pass told a story not just of French technique or Chinese tradition, but of resilience, adaptation, and the courage to listen to one's own voice. As Sarah worked, she noticed something extraordinary: the voices of doubt were being drowned out by new sounds, the sizzle of perfectly seared scallops, the murmur of delighted conversations, the clink of glasses raised in toast. But the most powerful sound was the one within, the quiet confidence that had always been there, waiting for her to listen. The first review appeared online before the night was even over. A prominent food blogger couldn't wait to share their experience. "Sage and Thyme isn't just another fusion restaurant," they wrote. "It's a deeply personal journey through two culinary traditions, handled with both respect and imagination." The simplified opening menu, which we're told was a last-minute decision, showcases Chef Chen's ability to find beauty in simplicity and confidence in authenticity. Other reviews followed, each more enthusiastic than the last. But it was a handwritten note left by an elderly Chinese couple that brought tears to Sarah's eyes: "We tasted home in your food. Not just our home, but something new and wonderful. Thank you for being brave enough to share your voice." In the years that followed, Sage and Thyme became known not just for its food but for its atmosphere of warmth and authenticity, a reflection of its owner's hard-won inner peace. Sarah gradually expanded the menu, but she kept her grandmother's recipes at its heart, understanding now that they weren't just about the food but about the wisdom they contained. The negative thoughts didn't disappear entirely, they still visited occasionally, like old acquaintances dropping by unannounced. But Sarah had learned to see them differently. They were like uninvited guests. They might show up, but she didn't have to give them the best seat in the house. She began teaching cooking classes in the restaurant's private dining room, sharing not just techniques but the deeper lessons she'd learned. "Listen to your ingredients," she'd tell her students. Listen to your instincts. The negative thoughts. They're just background noise in the symphony of your dreams. The real magic happens when you learn to conduct your own orchestra. 5 years after opening night, Sarah stood in her grandmother's old kitchen in Queens. The house had been sold years ago, but the new owners had kindly let her visit one last time before their renovation began. The space was smaller than she remembered, but the memories were just as powerful. She could almost see her grandmother standing at the stove, tasting the countless dishes that had been created here, hearing the wisdom that had been shared. Sarah pulled out her phone and took a picture of the worn countertop where she'd first learned to fold dumplings. That evening, back at Sage and Thyme, she gathered her staff, many of whom had been with her since that chaotic opening night. She showed them the picture and shared her grandmother's final lesson, one that had taken her years to fully understand. In cooking, as in life, the ingredients we're given aren't always what we expect. The timing isn't always perfect. The recipe doesn't always work out as planned. But if we learn to quiet the doubting voices and to listen to our ingredients and our instincts, we can create something beautiful. Something true. Sarah looked around at her restaurant, at the warm lights, the happy diners, the confident staff, and smiled. The negative thoughts that had once seemed so overwhelming were now just a faint whisper, barely audible above the symphony of her success. She had learned that the power wasn't in silencing the doubts but in choosing which voices to listen to. As she tied on her apron for another dinner service, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. She hadn't just built a successful restaurant, she'd found her own voice. In doing so, she'd discovered that sometimes the most powerful response to negative thoughts isn't to fight them but to simply let them pass by while you focus on creating something beautiful. Ready for service, she called out to her team, and the kitchen came alive with purpose and possibility. The negative thoughts might still come visiting, but they no longer had the power to drown out the music of her dreams. She had learned to conduct her own symphony, and it was more beautiful than she'd ever imagined.